Okay, so hi everyone, welcome back to our afternoon session. So we have two keynote speakers for you now, and I'll pass over to our first keynote speaker, who is George Kinnear from the University of Edinburgh. He's going to talk to us a bit about Stack.
All right, so thanks for having me.
Sorry, George, I think it's still sharing that screen. Okay, here we are.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think this is my first in-person presentation in about 3 years or something. It's nice to be back. So what I'm wanting to talk to you about this afternoon is Stack. We've heard a little bit about that earlier today. It's an e-assessment tool, and I'm going to explain to you, first of all, can I advance my slide? There we go, that's working now. So first of all, what is Stack, and a bit about the features of it. Then I'm going to move on to talk about a course that I've been teaching at Edinburgh for 4, going into 5 years now, which makes heavy use of Stack, and I'm going to talk about the kind of ideas that go into the design of it. And then I'm going to end with some examples of how those ideas about the design have been used by others to run courses elsewhere. Okay, so first of all, what is Stack? So it is an example of a computer-aided assessment tool, basically where the student is interacting with some web interface, and behind the scenes we have a computer algebra system, so that's able to do mathematics. In our case, Moodle is the web interface, so Stack is a question type in the Moodle quiz. So if you use Moodle at your institution, that'd be not necessarily straightforward. You need to do some installation to get the computer algebra stuff going on in the background, but it's possible. And actually at Edinburgh, we're not a Moodle institution. We use Blackboard, but it's possible to connect things up. So our students just click through to a version of Moodle, which they just see as Stack. And that's where they do their Stack quizzes. So that's Stack is doing this kind of going backwards and forwards between the interface and computer algebra system, which for Stack is Maxima. So Maxima is an open source computer algebra system, a bit like Maple or Mathematica. So just to give you some examples of what it looks like, here's a question from one of our courses. As we've seen in other examples earlier on, it's possible to randomize things. So here's another version of it with different numbers appearing. And because we've got this computer algebra system behind the scenes, it can generate the worked solutions when you have to do all the work of typing it out, but you can plug in the random numbers that pertain to the solution, so the students get a nicely laid out version of the question that they saw. It has various input types, so here's an example. I'm sorry this isn't working, but behind that, there is a version of this question from a few years ago where there were 6 boxes that the students had to type in for the basis for a column space. That kind of gives away the answer, so actually there's another way of typing in the answer where the students can put in as many rows and columns as they think it has. And as they type in, the system shows them the matrix that they've typed in. So that's kind of not giving away the answer if that's the part of it that you're trying to assess. And it's also possible to do lots of interesting things. So it's living in the browser, you can use all sorts of JavaScript tools. This one is using a tool called JSX Graph that is a bit like something like GeoGebra, that can do geometry. But the nice thing about this is the students can move the points around. And we've been experimenting with some ways where actually the way that the students move the points is their way of giving the answer, which helps us maybe get into some of the more graphical interpretation type questions as well. So that's a flavor of the kinds of questions that we can ask in Stack. I just wanted to go through, just as I was thinking about it, kind of what I see as some of the main benefits of using Stack, maybe relative to other e-assessment systems that are available. So I'll go through these one by one. And I'll try and use this example. So one from my course where I want the students to factorize this quartic polynomial given one of the roots. So they need to type in the full factorization of that. So the first one is about input validation. So if they type in an answer that the system can't interpret, it's not even wrong. So what do I mean by that? If the student types this in and they're missing the multiplication sign, Maxima, the computer algebra system, won't be able to deal with it. So we need to warn them about that. So before they can even submit the answer to be graded, they get a validation message that says it's incorrect. It's not a valid expression that we can send to Maxima. I should point out, if you don't want to insist that the students type in stars, there's a setting that you can sort of magically insert them on their behalf. But quite often we want to insist on them. So this will flag other things like missing brackets and so on as well. And that drastically cuts down the number of issues that you get from students where, oh, I typed in the answer, it's basically correct, why is it not marked it right? So that's been a really great feature. The second one is about what you do behind the scenes. So once you've got the student answer to grade, it's got a really thoughtful way of doing this robust grading of their answers. And really, you've got to be thinking about the properties of the student answer that you want to assess. So for this example that I was showing earlier, giving a basis for the column space, that was it with the 6 boxes. What do we want to do? Well, it's not just that it's the 6 numbers that I put in as a teacher, because they might have done a different way and got a different answer. That's what would make this question so annoying to mark actually on paper. But what we can do is just using the underlying computer algebra system, get it to take the reduced row echelon form of both my answer and their answer and check that they're the same. So that's really what I want to check whether the answer is correct. So that's where we're really benefiting from having a powerful computer algebra system behind the scenes. The way this works as well is using this idea called a potential response tree. So basically like a decision tree where you go through and check various properties that you might be interested in. So for this example, I want to check that their answer is in factored form. So they've given a factored version of the polynomial. Now, it just so happens this is quite a common thing that you want to do in assessing students. So there is already an answer test built into Stack that does that. So is the student's answer in the factored form of the teacher's answer? But you can go wild with these, and I've seen examples from others that have got massive trees that are very complicated. This one is relatively simple, but so if they've not given it in factored form, maybe I want to give them some partial marks. So if they've maybe got a couple of the brackets right, then I want to give them some of the marks, but also give them feedback about the bits that were wrong. So here's an example of what that question would produce. So if they've just typed in, they've got 2 of the factors right, but they've still got a quadratic term, Stack actually for free is giving me, you could do more work on this term here. So that comes from the factored form answer test. And then it's telling them which ones they've got correct, which ones they've therefore got the mark for. The third thing that has been a real boon having this is question tests. So if anyone is in kind of software development world, this is like unit testing. So unlike in other systems where we've got all these random variants, when the student opens the quiz, they may see a different random version. It's kind of, the dice have been rolled at that moment when they open the quiz. What we do with Stack instead is I, as the teacher, sit with dice and roll them a lot and produce all the different versions of the question. So I can see at a glance what all the different variants of the question are looking like. And that helps you if you've been kind of overambitious with randomizing and one student's going to get some crazy big numbers, you can delete that version so that it's not going to be shown to students. So you get that bit of quality control beforehand. And also you get the nice ticks down the side. So that's kind of nice for if you like getting ticks on things. What that's doing is running various tests on the question to see that it's behaving in the way that I want it to. So these question tests check that the grading works as expected. There's a lot of detail here, but basically that answer that I typed in where I had a quadratic term still there, I want to check that, so the expected score is 0.5. I want it to get half marks, and indeed it does, and that's good to know. So you can build in all these different tests to see if the student gives a certain wrong answer, it needs to be marked this way. And also I, as the author, like to see this page with all the tests because it shows me the sort of feedback that the students are getting on those answers, kind of at a glance. It's really useful actually when you've got student interns who maybe written the questions for you to be able to just go and have a quick look and see is the feedback that they've written all sort of reasonable. Okay, so those were the key benefits of Stack. There are some other things. So the fact that it is open source, it's free. And it has a community around it who are contributing to the code. So it's not just, so Chris Sanguin at Edinburgh is the lead developer. But as he likes to say, if he gets hit by a bus tomorrow, it's not going to disappear. It's widely used. It's developed quite responsively. So I guess I'm lucky being along the corridor from Chris in normal times. If I want something added into Stack, I just need to pester him enough at lunchtime and eventually it happens. So it's not to say that he'll automatically do everything. You know, he's got the principles behind the design, but it does take things on board, and the development moves in accordance with what the users need from it. And as I mentioned, we've got this kind of widely growing community around it. So down at the bottom there, Abacus and Domain are two examples of sort of consortiums that have come together to share question bank materials. And we also have the Stack conference, so that's been going for about 5 years now. We have annual meetings. The last one in April, there's about 100 people there. So there's quite a lot of people around the world using it, and I've been finding it quite a kind of open sharing community. So welcoming of new people kind of getting on board as well. Okay, so that was my sort of whistle-stop tour of what Stack is all about. Now I'll move on to how I'm actually using it in designing a course. So at Edinburgh, this is what our first year curriculum looks like. Our students are doing half their time on mathematics courses and the other half doing other things, part of this kind of broad Scottish education. These are quite large classes. So this year, almost getting up to 900 students on the big linear algebra and calculus classes, because those include not just math students, but computer scientists and others who are interested in doing some maths as well. With that broad range of students coming from all sorts of backgrounds, we had noticed over a number of years a kind of need to get some students up to speed. So they've maybe not had as much preparation in maths at school, so they need a bit of getting up to speed, particularly to handle the calculus course in the second semester, which has a lot to get through. So we added this course, Fundamentals of Algebra and Calculus, in semester 1. Fits kind of neatly into that slot, and that was kind of my job to lead the development of that, together with a colleague, Richard Gratwick, a few years ago. This year, I was running it by myself with nearly 300 students. So the steer from setting up this course was that I think we heard an example earlier where you've not got any marking time. So it's really an upfront effort to develop this course so that it can scale to deal with these large number of students. And obviously Stack comes in to the assessment side of that. Topics in the course are much as you might expect, kind of high school mathematics, so getting up to things like integration by parts and so on, and this kind of supporting algebra work. So we have 11-week semesters. What we did was come up with 10 topics, 5 algebra and 5 calculus, and we do a topic each week. So this is the approach that we came up with, was to put everything into a set of Stack quizzes. So everything that the students need to do for a given week is going to be here, living in the Moodle, but essentially a set of Stack quizzes. Now there's 2 parts to this. I'm going to talk about the idea of putting the textbook in the quiz. So that's these sections of material that the students have to work through, roughly like what we might do in a lecture and the associated practice that they would be doing. There is another idea underlying all this of mastery assessment. So each week, the students have assessments to complete, and the grades that they get in those quizzes throughout the semester is what makes up their grade for the course. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but I will give you a link at the end if you're interested to read more. So this idea about putting the textbook in the quiz, it came from me reading around kind of cognitive science ideas about how people learn. And basically the idea that rather than just reading things or restudying things, actually being tested on it can help your learning. It's not just a way of measuring how much you understand something, but it can actually improve your understanding. Comes the problem though of where to actually put these questions that you want to ask. So quite often in textbooks, you'll find a set of exercises at the end, but maybe you want to also intersperse them through the text. As people are meeting new concepts, ask some questions about it. It's quite a natural thing that people do in their lecture notes, embedding little exercises. So I was quite inspired by this study where they looked at that basically in a sort of lab setting, compared those 2 approaches of sprinkling questions throughout the text or putting them at the end. And what they concluded from that was actually doing either as good, but actually better still is to do both. So hit the students with lots of questions. So kind of inspired by that, that's what we've done. So we've put as I say, the textbook in the quiz. So all the content that we might have in lecture notes appears there in the quiz as a sort of description item. So it's not an actual question that students answer, but it's a block of HTML that I can do whatever I like in. But mixed in with that are various simple questions, including multiple choice ones, just to check their understanding of the new concepts. And you'll see in the kind of contents page for that quiz, at the end, quite often we'll have a sort of mixed practice that brings together exercises from that whole topic. Here's another page just showing the sort of things that we can do. So going back before anyone had heard of coronavirus, I was recording these video lecture clips. It felt very new at the time. So you can embed videos, of course, and embed other things like drag and drop activities. So this idea of kind of putting all the stuff into the quiz, Chris and I tried to come up with a snappy name. We came up with Codex, which is an old word for a book, standing for Coherently Organized Digital Exercises and Expositions. So it's kind of this mix of the text that you want the students to read with activities. Just want to also mention a couple of other ways that we've used Stack in the course. So just to touch on these briefly. So one is the idea of faded worked examples. So here's another excerpt from the course where we've got a video worked example that I go through. But instead of just giving the students then problems like that to solve, we go through a sort of scaffolded sequence with them, where we first give them a worked example where they just need to complete the last step. Then we give them a more scaffolded version where there's more gaps for them to fill in the process. And then it's over to them to solve the complete problem for themselves. So we've used that sort of structure for quite a few of the key procedures in the course, just to give the students a bit more scaffolding working towards the open problem. And it comes again from some reading around various experiments that have been done on this approach, finding that this approach of kind of fading out the steps from the end really helps the students to learn these procedures. And the other idea that I wanted just to highlight is using Stack to encourage retrieval practice. So again, connected to this idea of the testing effect, actually encouraging students to retrieve things from their memory rather than just restudy them can strengthen that memory for them. So trying to build in opportunities for that during the course. We've done that in various ways with course design by mixing around the topics. So they don't do all the differentiation all at the same time. It gives us a chance to come back to it and get them to do that recall practice for themselves. But we do embed that in other ways. So for example, when we move on to integration, it's quite common to start off saying, hey, we've done differentiation. And it's just the opposite. Here are all these rules that you know, so therefore we know all these integrals. But instead of telling them, hey, all these rules that you know, we've got a Stack question that encourages them to try to remember what were all those rules that you learned a couple of weeks ago about differentiation. And using Stack, it's not that the students have to enter the answers in a certain order. It just knows that the thing that they've said is the derivative of the thing in that row is correct or not. And it can also suggest maybe some other ones that they've missed. Okay, so those are a couple of examples of ways that we've used Stack in the design of that course. And I'm going to end just showing you some other kind of ways that people have picked up these ideas and used them in their courses. So the first one is thinking about our engineering maths teaching that we do at Edinburgh. So this has really been led by my colleague Konstantina Zerva. So she's been employed for a number of years now as our sort of Stack person. So she helps with rolling out Stack into new courses, writing questions, and increasingly coordinating interns who are helping to do the heavy lifting of writing stuff. So right at the start of the pandemic, we were looking at what can we do. We're going to need to be using Stack a lot more. For our engineering maths course, we looked at the HELM workbook. So that stands for Helping Engineers Learn Mathematics. It was a big collaborative project. I think it was 2008. And it's widely used at various institutions, particularly in England, so around Loughborough, where the project was based. They host these PDF workbooks that cover essentially the whole of the curriculum that you might want to teach engineers about mathematics. And I think at Loughborough, they basically make up their engineering maths courses by, which workbooks do you want to do in that course? It consists of notes and exercises and problems. So what we've done is, right at the start of the pandemic, we had a big team of interns working to convert that to Stack. So they took the notes part of it and turned it into the text in the quiz. They took the problems that were there and created stack versions of them that often feature randomization and all those features that I was showing you about the worked solutions that can depend on the version. Konstantina's been working away on that for the past couple of years, and it's obviously now gone through being used with hundreds of our engineering math students, so that's really ironed out all the kind of easy problems that we've noticed with the questions. So Konstantina's job this summer is to kind of wrap all that up as a resource that other people can use. So look out for those appearing soon as an open resource. And Konstantina was talking about it at the IMS conference that's going on just now. You can catch up with her recording if you want to hear more about that. Actually, another IMS talk is about a course that is in our third year. So I mentioned earlier that Richard Gratwick co-developed the course that I was talking about. He's then gone on to be tasked with teaching our third year students, about 250 of them, about complex variables, so doing contour integrals and so on. And based on the experience that we had with teaching that course, Fundamentals of Algebra and Calculus, he's taken some of the ideas from there and moved them into this higher level course. So essentially, starting with his very traditional set of LaTeX lecture notes, again with support from other colleagues, so Stephen O'Hagan, who's the learning designer in the school, and various student interns were employed to help with this process of converting those lecture notes into a set of stack quizzes, so in the sort of codex style, with Richard recording little video clips to intersperse. And that's allowed him actually to reduce some of the time that he would have spent in lectures on the more kind of writing stuff on the board side of things. So his lectures are now much more interactive and based on peer instruction type things. So here's just some examples of the sort of questions. So again, it doesn't necessarily need to be students typing in the answer. You can have multiple choice questions, and these are all randomized, so the students will get different examples if they want to practice lots. And again, Stack, because it has this powerful computer algebra system underneath, can handle this kind of more complicated mathematics and still produce these nice worked solutions. And the other example that I was quite pleased to learn at the last Stack conference, there are some colleagues down in New Zealand who've heard about these ideas and were inspired by that during the pandemic as well. So they took their courses and created these sort of Stack-based textbook in the quiz ideas, including various interactive graphics and so on. Okay. So if you want to know more about what's been going on, I've set up a page. I actually didn't check that link, but hopefully it's still working. So on my blog, I've kind of gathered together everything that's out there about this course, including the paper down at the bottom there with Richard and our colleague Anna. She did some interviews with students who took the course and focus groups and so on, to really explore their experience of what it's like doing the course. That paper kind of goes through some of the ideas that I was telling you about the course design, and also has the stuff about the mastery grading. So really all the kind of design ideas that went into the course, plus some evaluation of it. If you want to actually see what the course looks like in a bit more detail, from that page there is a link to our demonstration site. So at Edinburgh, we've got our server that our students use, and you can't get access to that because you have to go through university login, but we have a separate site that anyone can create an account on. And once you've done that, you can enroll on this demo of the course. And within there, you'll see the week that I was talking about. So there's a week of the course that you can try out as a student. And also, I guess, once you've set up your account on that demo site, you've got access to all the info you need about how to author Stack questions and get started with it. Okay, so that's me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, George. It's very interesting. I will now pass this over to any questions. I'll just
I think I have 5 questions.
Okay.
It's a developer question. Why do you choose Maxima and not things like Maple and the other ones that they were? You know.
So Maxima is open source. So I guess if you go back to the early days, there were these early systems. Maxima is the open source one.
So, yeah, okay,
so that allows us to use it quite widely.
And as someone who's used stat system quite often for the question test, I know in software engineering world, you create unit tests before you create the things you're unit testing. Do you do that as well for yourself for question tests, or do you create them while you're creating questions?
Yeah, so it tends to be more of an afterward. So once you've, for me anyway, once I've written the questions, when I go and add in the tests, I guess you could get disciplined about it and add in the tests.
Software engineering world is a very big thing to do unit tests beforehand.
I don't think there's anything that would necessarily stop you from doing that. It's just I'm not that disciplined.
That's fair. On a related note, do you personally write a plan of what your question is going to be and then sort of do everything, do what you think decision tree is on paper and then implement it in Stack, or do you just implement it in Stack straight in off your head?
So yeah, when Richard and I were writing the big course, I mean, each week has about 100 Stack questions in it. So we needed a plan for what we needed. Okay. And then we kind of went through and picked things off as we had the energy for it. So yeah, first of all, we'd set up sort of stubbed questions where I know it wants to be a question about that, or maybe a link to another file where we'd saved it's a version of that question, but make it random. Then once you actually get into writing the question, you can basically spend as long on it as you have the energy for.
Yeah.
So at some point you just have to say it's enough, and it's kind of good enough at that point. The nice thing about it though is that you can come back to it. So the example I showed actually with the polynomial and the partial credit, in the course materials, that question just uses the factored form test and there's no partial credit. So students don't get any marks, it doesn't count towards their grade there, so it just gives them the feedback. But when it came to using that question in the assessed quiz, it became important to add in the partial credit. Yeah. And that can happen even after the students have taken the quiz and you realize there's this common mistake, I want to add in some partial marks for that. You can go back and kind of edit the question to change the tree to add in those partial marks and then regrade everyone.
So you can regrade after it's already done.
That's been a lifesaver for exactly that situation where I've done something that's a wee bit wrong, student emails about it, I can fix the question and say, I fixed it, you've got the extra points.
Yes, sorry. Next one, so as software engineering, because you mentioned it, does Stack have a command line interface, or does it have to be done through the GUI? Because I've played around with it a bit, and it can be a bit slow sometimes. So I'm just wondering if there's a command line interface or like a language behind it that we can use.
So I think Chris did play with the idea of having a sort of markup language where you could write a question sort of offline and then just paste it in.
There's a way to do Moodle quizzes through LaTeX, I think. But
I
haven't seen anything similar for Stack.
That only, I think, really ever existed as a prototype.
Okay.
Basically, the difficulty was to try and have it keeping it in sync. So basically everything needs to go through this middle question editing form, and somehow keeping those two versions in sync is quite hard. What I've kind of worked around it. So with middle, you can export all your questions as XML. So where I've had a question that ended up doing quite a lot of repetitive stuff, exported to XML, did it there, and then re-imported it. Yeah. So it's possible to kind of work around those things.
For your course of the quiz questions, do you have a standard lecture notes as well, or do you just do the course of the quiz?
Yeah, so that's the kind of the main feature with that, is that we just, what I showed was the only resource that students have. So all the, what might be lecture notes are there in the quiz alongside it.
Which naturally is the question, can they redo the quizzes, not the assessment quizzes, the formative quizzes, whenever they want?
Yeah, so we've used quite different settings on those. So for the sections of content, it's essentially just open, and they can have as many attempts as they want. The grades on it don't really matter for anything. And actually each question, once they've submitted it, they can try another question like this. So they can replace just an individual question and get a different version.
So they can re-randomize it?
Yeah. Okay. For the assessed quiz, it works a bit differently, and they only get maybe one attempt. Yeah.
Cool. I think that's all my questions.
Okay.
So,
did I pass?
Thanks. It's probably a less technical question. We run something similar, and a common thing students say is, we had to teach ourselves. I'm certainly not siding with that criticism, but I'm just wondering how you'd address that. Is it a criticism you get with a platform like this, and how do you address that?
So I think we have had some student feedback where, thinking back to maybe even the very first year we ran the course, we had like 2 or 3 lectures timetabled. So we had a lecture in week 1 where we introduced the course. And then I didn't really know what to do with the other lecture slots that I was given, frankly. Seemed a bit pointless. And we quickly dropped those. I mean, there were some students who in the feedback said they would have liked more of those kind of lecture sessions. But I think by and large, the students were quite satisfied. And that, I think, came through in the interviews that Anna was doing, where they liked the flexibility of it. So they could, well, part of the difficulty with this is we're expecting them to spend about 12 hours a week doing this course, but it's not in their timetable anywhere. So I've got some activities in the very first week of the course where, you know, a stat question where they have to fill in what they think their timetable is going to be for working on the course, just to try and encourage them to actually think it through and commit to, you know, that's the day when I'm going to start working on the quiz for the week. But yeah, so that's the difficulty, that they have to organise their own time on it. But that has pluses and minuses, and I think the students appreciate the flexibility that they can work it around other courses that they might be doing as well.
Any more questions?
Well, thank you for the talk. I think it seems really cool. I didn't realise it could do as much as it does. I wanted to ask about something that I'm not even sure I believe as a criticism, but I thought might come up. Is, do you think students that learn using this kind of technology then have less confidence in writing mathematics in a less structured way in subsequent modules?
So it was certainly a concern I had when I was first tasked with writing this course. You know, getting students prepared to do well in first year. What is it that they need? And it seems to me one component of it is the sort of procedural stuff that we've built into this course. And yeah, there is another direction to it, which is their writing, that I think is important, but is not really being addressed here. And I've not had to encounter that with any of the courses I've been teaching, but I know Richard, in kind of using these resources in his course, essentially has been viewing it as, you know, all the stat questions that were being created essentially were there in the lecture notes anyway, or something like them. So it was the sort of thing that they would be asking in lecture notes you would expect students to be doing as they're working through the course anyway, but is actually just making it a stat question that they get feedback on. So I think in that sense, it's not doing anything maybe less than we might be expecting usually in that course, where they also have workshops and hand-ins and so on. So I think, yeah, it's not possible to do absolutely everything with this, but it's good at what it's good at.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question about your workbooks that you've written in HTML. I was wondering, when you load those up on different devices, do those render differently on different devices, or can you make it do that, like you would normally do with standard HTML?
So when I say HTML, it's really all within the Moodle quiz structure. So we live inside the Moodle quiz, and then we get this box where we can do whatever we like. I'm not 100% sure. I guess I have played around with Moodle on my phone. I'm not super confident that it works brilliantly on a mobile device. It's certainly, at the last stat conference, we were hearing from some colleagues in Africa, so in Kenya. They'd got in touch with Chris, and they were actually using our demo site with, you know, hundreds of their students as they were trying it out. And they were basically all on their phones, it turns out. So it does seem possible actually for them to work through that. I don't think we're quite as good at the accessibility side of things as we could be, you know, in terms of all the things that we're seeing earlier from you with dark mode and so on. But that all, I think, it's kind of this choice that Chris made a while ago. So Stack used to be a completely standalone thing, but he made the choice to make it part of Moodle, so that it's a question type in the Moodle quiz, which saves him from having to, you know, worry about usernames and passwords and so on. Someone's already done that for Moodle. And it's the same issue there with the overall Moodle quiz, and how accessible that is kind of determines how these workbooks become accessible as well.
So in a similar way, can you make it, the previous stuff, that you can render those notes as PDFs for students that would request for them to be printed?
So no, so that's really a problem that we've got at the moment, and particularly Richard and Stephen who've been thinking about this course. Richard has been maintaining a sort of separate LaTeX version of the notes still that you can build a PDF, because it is nice to have everything there together. And he was admitting actually having it printed out because he likes being able to flick through things. So there is a job to do there, and we're starting to think about that. You know, this actually a similar sort of book down style thing. Can we have our set of notes that we then knit to a stack quiz or to a PDF? That would be the kind of dream, but yeah, we've not got a concrete plan in that direction yet.
There's a couple of questions on Stack, or one we have. So one question is just, do students need to be experiencing LaTeX in order to give their answers in Stack?
No, so it's a different syntax to LaTeX. It's essentially what they're typing in the box is maxima, ultimately. So that's why in some questions we were insisting on them typing in stars and so on. So I did mention that that's an option that you can control as a teacher. So if you don't want your students to be worrying about the stars, it can try to guess where they should be. But it's not perfect when you've got, you know, f of x and so on. What does that mean? So sometimes Stack might get wrong. So we do kind of take the line that we want our students to get trained up in being able to communicate properly with a computer. So part of that is learning the syntax that we need to use. So yeah, there is a bit of a learning curve if you want to get students typing in longer expressions. But as the example I was showing with the matrix, so that's a kind of relatively new feature where as they type, it will show them how the system is interpreting it. So they get that kind of visual feedback as well.
Do I have any more questions?
You answered the second one, to be fair, because it was about access to notes.
Yeah.
So that was answered in the previous one.
Perfect. Okay. So any more questions in the room? Online? No. If not, just thank George once again.
Thank you.